It's been quite a while since I talked about a US dialect of English, so I thought I'd revisit that topic with something a bit more specific than I've done in the past on US dialects, which is to zone in on a couple of specific people's accents and analyse them a little bit. So it'll be focused mainly on pronunciation rather than syntax. So there are syntactic features of Southern Louisiana English which are quite interesting, but I won't focus on those here because I don't feel confident that I know enough about them not to make a load of mistakes. But pronunciation is something I'm fairly confident on, so we'll focus on a couple of people's specific accents and compare them. And it will be more specific than just Louisiana. It will be New Orleans specifically because Louisiana is a very large place, and of course there'll be accent diversity within the state. So New Orleans is enough to go on for the time being, I think. Um, Louisiana is one of my favourite corners of the US culturally speaking. I've never actually been there. I've never been to the US in general, but just in terms of the music they produce, the food they produce. Um, so for one thing, you have Cajun English, and that's a form of American English that's built onto a French substrate. Now, when I say a French substrate, what I mean is a historical layer of French underpinning Cajun English. So this is where a lot of French-speaking Americans historically have learned English as a second language. And when you learn something as a second language, you often learn it slightly imperfectly, for want of a better word. And instead of using features that a native speaker of the target language would naturally use, you kind of import features from your native language into the target language. So that might be phrases, it might be sentence constructions, or it might be features of pronunciation. So an example of that might be if a Spanish speaker was learning English and they wanted to express their age, they might say, I have 30 years, instead of the more standard, I am 30, because in Spanish you'd normally say the equivalent of I have 30 years. So it's the speaker directly translating the phrase into the new language just because that's how they naturally think about the concept of age. If a community of speakers does this without it being corrected, for want of a better word, they'll eventually pass it on to their children, and the children may end up being native English speakers but using this Spanish construction because that's how they were taught by their parents. And then over time, that construction seeps into the local English. And that's what a substrate feature is. Of course, that's a very simple example. I don't know if it's ever actually popped up anywhere because that kind of mistake gets corrected pretty quickly. But that's an example of the way it happens. And in parts of Louisiana, that's what happened with English being built onto a French substrate. And there's also historically been a very large black community around New Orleans and other areas who were originally enslaved, speaking a variety of African American vernacular English, which is a socio-elective English used by black communities around the US, which of course varies from place to place itself. And features of that have also bled into the local English. So today I'm going to compare the speech of Louis Armstrong, or Louis Armstrong, pronunciation of his name is fiercely argued about, and Dr. John, two musicians I admire very much, both from New Orleans, and I think for a while they actually lived very near each other. So we're going to start off by looking at the vowel qualities, and I'll point out some interesting features as we go along. I don't know how I'll represent it visually. I'll probably have a chart with Louis Armstrong on one side, Louis Armstrong, whatever, and Dr. John on the other.
Why should you change music? Mozart didn't change. Bach didn't change.
Some people call it progressive, Louis.
Well, what is progressive? You tell me, because all we play is good music. We never did worry about styles. Ain't no such thing as styles in music. Ain't but two kind, good or bad. That's all.
Hey, I want to thank y'all. I want to thank my family. I see some of y'all here, and it's a blessing. You know, like, I feel like I'm blessed to get a reward from y'all. I feel like I'm blessed to be standing, to be breathing.
I think they both have what's called the pin-pen merger, which means that for both of them, the vowels in the words pin and pen are the same. So the two words pin and pen sound identical. So the vowel before a nasal consonant like n, m, or ng becomes the same as the vowel. But when it's not before a nasal consonant, the vowel often stays separate from the vowel, and that's a really typical feature of southeastern US speech in general, and it also pops up a lot in African American vernacular English throughout the US. So that is and merging to something like before a nasal consonant n, m, ng. And we're thinking of consonants in terms of actual sounds rather than letters. So ng is a consonant in its own right, spelt in the IPA like this. An unusual thing in Armstrong's speech is that he tends to pronounce the vowel in the word goose a bit further forward in the mouth than you would expect. And I'm not the best person to demonstrate this because my goose vowel is also a bit fronted. So a non-fronted goose vowel would sound something like goose, but a slightly fronted goose vowel is something like goose, goose, and that's a feature of Armstrong's speech that Dr. John doesn't have quite so much. It's typical of Louisiana speech to smooth the vowel in the face lexical set, and you can hear that very clearly in Armstrong's pronunciation of certain words.
Yes,
Why
sir.
should you change music? Change.
So by smoothing, I mean that rather than pronouncing it as a diphthong, a, that goes from one vowel quality to another, a, he says one vowel quality throughout. And that's, I think, probably by coincidence. That's very similar to how a lot of southeastern British dialects pronounced it in the 1600s, the way Armstrong pronounced it there. Although it's probably not a direct survival, it's probably a result of the vowel having diphthongized in the 1700s, which it did in most dialects, and then re-monophthongized later on. And that might, again, be a French substrate feature, because as far as I know, someone correct me if I'm wrong, French doesn't have the diphthong a in the middle of a word. It can have something similar at the end of a word, but not in the middle. So the closest things French has, I think, are air and e. So it might be that that's an effect of French speakers kind of learning English with a monophthong there, just because it's easier for them to pronounce. Although possibly not, it might just be a development that happened in its own right. The vowel in a word like price, so the I vowel, is also smoothed in Dr. John's accent to something like prass. Oh, I've done that very horribly. And that also happens in a lot of southern US dialects. But Armstrong doesn't have that quite so much, so his price vowel is a slight diphthong, something like price.
Yes,
Why
sir.
should you change music?
I see some of y'all here.
Why?
Like a small number of other US accents, New Orleans English is very often non-rhotic, or only partially rhotic, which means that in certain environments a r sound will not be pronounced, or at least it won't be pronounced as a r sound. So a word like nurse, for example, is likely to be pronounced something like nice.
I got a lot of my personal worries. Personal.
A word like start is likely to be pronounced like start. A word like north will be pronounced like north, and so on. So rather than pronouncing a r in these words, the r gets absorbed into the vowel and changes it slightly. Non-rhotic accents can work in a number of different ways, so I have a non-rhotic accent myself, but when I say words like north, nurse, and start that would historically have had a r sound in them, they're just monophthongs for me. Or, are, north, nurse, start. But standard German is non-rhotic, and it does a very similar thing to New Orleans English, so a word like this is pronounced for rather than just for. I don't know whether the New Orleans thing is a result of German influence, so there were certainly a lot of German speakers there at one time, but even nowadays a lot of dialects of German are fully rhotic, and at that point in history I don't know if non-rhoticity in German was as widespread as it is today, so I wouldn't be confident saying that was down to German influence. It's worth saying a lot of African American vernacular English speakers throughout the US speak non-rhotically as well, so that's a cross pan North American thing for African American vernacular English speakers. Not that all African American vernacular English speakers speak non-rhotically, but a lot do across the US. Dr. John has a trace of a r sound in a lot of words that would be non-rhotic in Armstrong's accent, and that's possibly just down to him being, 30 or 40 years younger than Armstrong. There are two features I'd be a bit more confident saying were the result of French influence, and the first one of those is unaspirated plosives. So the sounds p, t, and k in English are what we call voiceless plosives, and those can be aspirated, which is to say pronounced with a little burst of air, p, or unaspirated, pronounced without that burst of air, b. And you can feel that by holding your hand in front of your mouth as you say them, and if you say p aspirated, you'll feel the burst of air on your hand. In most English accents, you aspirate these sounds if they are the only sound in the onset of a stressed syllable. So the onset of a syllable is a cluster of consonants that starts the syllable off. So in the word pill, the p is aspirated because it's the only thing in the syllable onset. In spill, it's unaspirated because there's also a s in the syllable onset, and you can kind of hear the difference if you listen carefully. Pill, spill, pill, spill. The p in spill almost sounds a bit like a b sound because it's unaspirated. Pill, spill. In the word top, the t is aspirated because it's the only thing in the syllable onset, but the p is unaspirated there because it's not in the syllable onset. Top, top. The difference can be very tricky for an English speaker to hear because in English they're allophones of the same phoneme, so we consider them basically the same sound, but there is a difference, and that difference is meaningful in some languages. A lot of New Orleans speakers, especially older or broader speakers, don't aspirate plosives in any situation, so they pronounce sounds like p and k more like a French or a Spanish speaker would, more like b and g. So listen to how Dr. John says the t in to be standing.
To be standing, to be breathing.
Now, Dr. John doesn't do this all the time, so sometimes he aspirates his plosives p, t, k, which is probably a result of him being a bit younger. Louis Armstrong is a lot more consistent with not aspirating them.
You're supposed to sing, you're supposed to relax, you're supposed to play, and them cats, when I looked around, I said, they BSing.
Now, this kind of thing can happen on its own in languages, so a language can just have plosives de-aspirate themselves on their own. But I think if there are any features that are good candidates for being French substrate features, this is probably one of them. And the other one is the nasalization of certain vowels. So when you nasalize a vowel, you push a lot of air involved in pronouncing it through the nose rather than the mouth. So rather than, for example, ah, you might say ah. So this happens in French a lot. So what used to be a vowel consonant cluster like on becomes a single nasalized vowel like on, just because it takes less effort to pronounce. And this happens a lot in New Orleans English, which you can hear in both of the speakers we have here.
Understand?
Want to thank my family that's been with me for a long time.
You can also hear speakers of this dialect of English changing the sounds into dental fricatives that are voiced the into d sounds. Now, most US dialects show some influence from languages other than English, but hopefully this nice example has shown a couple of angles on influence on this particular dialect in a bit more detail. I've only discussed phonology here again. I've not discussed particular grammatical constructions that are unique to New Orleans English, but there are lots of them, and there are also lots of unique grammatical features of African American vernacular English that I've not described here. But maybe this helps some people visualize their own accents or the accents of their friends slightly better.